April 7, 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. A fuel line snapped free from a Grumman F4F Wildcat with a sharp metallic sound as Second Lieutenant James Sweat settled into the cockpit. Sweat, still damp from the tropical heat, had no way of knowing that within minutes he would be thrust from the life of a regular working-class American into a moment that would secure his place in U.S. aviation history. His hands, hardened by years spent maintaining marine machinery in his father's San Francisco Bay Area workshop, rested steadily on the control stick. Despite this being his first real combat sortie, he showed none of the hesitation one might expect. Then the radio burst to life. Condition red. Condition very red. Approximately 150 Japanese aircraft inbound from the north. Every pilot stationed on Guadalcanal understood the urgency. A massive enemy strike, the largest since Pearl Harbor, was approaching fast. Between the incoming bombers and the American fleet stood just 76 Allied fighters racing skyward to gain altitude. Among them was a 22-year-old former industrial worker who had never fired at a hostile aircraft, had never encountered an enemy outside of training footage, and had never experienced the confusion of air combat. The Japanese formations, advancing in disciplined order, had no idea they were about to face a pilot whose mix of instinct, preparation, and raw talent would soon produce one of the most remarkable individual performances of the Pacific Air War. James Sweat was born on June 15, 1920, in Seattle, Washington, the eldest of three children of George Sweat and Nellie Emily Burns Sweat. His father, an electrical engineer and Marine Corps reservist, operated a company that manufactured pumps and turbines for maritime use. During James's childhood, the family moved to San Mateo, California, where George expanded the business in the San Francisco Bay region. The firm produced essential but unglamorous industrial equipment for ships and harbors. Growing up around machinery, young James became familiar with the practical language of mechanics, gears, pressure systems, horsepower, and maintenance routines. He attended San Mateo High School, where he was an unremarkable student by most accounts. After graduating in 1939, he enrolled at the College of San Mateo, a local junior college that served many working-class families. There he encountered an opportunity that would alter his future. Anticipating possible involvement in a global conflict, the U.S. government had created the Civilian Pilot Training Program, which subsidized flight instruction for college students. Sweat joined eagerly and discovered he had a natural aptitude for flying. The same mechanical understanding that helped him grasp industrial equipment translated easily to aircraft systems and handling. He advanced quickly through training, flying solo early and logging hours at a rapid pace. By the time he completed the civilian program, he had accumulated roughly 450 hours in the air, far more than many naval aviation cadets would receive. This experience would later set him apart from peers and even some instructors. As global tensions intensified through 1940 and early 1941, war seemed increasingly likely. Europe was engulfed in conflict and Japan continued expanding across Asia. On August 26, 1941, James Sweat enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve as a seaman second class and began formal flight training the following month. At 21, he left behind the stability of his father's business to pursue military aviation. Training at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi in Texas confirmed his abilities. He combined strong flying skills with discipline and focus, completing the program in early 1942 within the top 10% of his class. That ranking gave him an unusual choice: accept a commission in the Navy or transfer to the Marine Corps. He chose the Marines. On April 1, 1942, exactly 1 year before the mission that would define him, Second Lieutenant James Sweat earned his wings as a naval aviator. Physically, he appeared ordinary, 5 feet 11 inches tall, about 154 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes. Nothing in his appearance hinted at future distinction in combat. Further preparation followed. He trained at Quantico, qualified for carrier operations aboard the USS Wolverine on Lake Michigan, and completed tactical instruction in San Diego. Marine aviation training for the Pacific Theater focused on survival as much as offensive action. Pilots were taught to maintain speed, avoid turning battles with Japanese Zeros, rely on wingmen, conserve ammunition, and fire only when certain of a hit. These lessons came from instructors who had survived early setbacks at Pearl Harbor and Wake Island and understood the cost of mistakes. In March 1943, Sweat departed for the Southwest Pacific aboard the escort carrier USS Nassau. The journey included additional training stops in Hawaii before reaching the combat zone. Veteran pilots shared sobering stories of relentless Japanese attacks, multiple daily sorties, and heavy losses that sometimes wiped out entire squadrons. When Marine Fighting Squadron 221, VMF 221, arrived at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides late that month, the pilots received final briefings before moving forward. Sweat was assigned to VMF 221, part of Marine Air Group 21 under the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. The squadron had earned a reputation during the defense of Wake Island in December 1941, where a handful of Wildcats had fought against overwhelming Japanese forces. Now rebuilt with new aircraft and pilots, the unit flew to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to support ongoing operations. Henderson Field was a critical asset. Originally built by Japanese construction units in mid-1942, it had been captured by US Marines that August and defended through constant attacks. Conditions were primitive. A single runway made of pierced steel planking, sandbag revetments, makeshift shelters, oppressive heat, heavy rain, and widespread malaria. Despite these hardships, the airfield was strategically vital. Aircraft operating from Henderson controlled the surrounding seas and disrupted Japanese reinforcement efforts. Holding Guadalcanal meant securing the Solomon Islands, which in turn protected supply routes to Australia. Much depended on that rough airstrip and the pilots who flew from it. During his first weeks on Guadalcanal, James Sweat learned the routines of combat operations, preparing for engagements that had not yet come. Soon, however, that would change. VMF 221 maintained near constant patrols over the area, yet the division led by James "Jimmy" Sweat saw no enemy action for some time. Their flights were largely routine, escorting, patrolling, and gaining confidence in both their aircraft and each other. Sweat used the quiet period to sharpen his flying skills and build coordination with his wingmen. For weeks, the war remained distant. That changed in early April 1943 when Allied intelligence began to detect troubling signs of a large Japanese buildup. Aerial reconnaissance revealed dense concentrations of aircraft at Rabaul, Bougainville, Kahili, and Balali, and intercepted radio traffic surged. These preparations were part of a major Japanese counteroffensive and air operation directed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto intended to check Allied momentum in the Solomon Islands. For the effort, roughly 350 aircraft were assembled. Fighters and dive bombers were even pulled from 4 aircraft carriers to reinforce land-based units. The opening strike was scheduled for 7 April 1943 and aimed at Allied ships and aircraft around Guadalcanal. The main attacking force would include 67 Aichi D3A dive bombers known to the Allies as VALs, escorted by 110 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. In total, 177 aircraft would launch from bases more than 400 miles to the northwest. The formation was carefully organized. 2 fighter sweeps would lead, followed by 4 successive waves of dive bombers timed for maximum impact. Japanese planners expected heavy damage to American forces. Although Allied intelligence had identified the buildup, it could not determine exactly when the attack would occur. Early warning depended heavily on coast watchers, Australian and New Zealand personnel concealed on Japanese-held islands who observed and reported enemy movements. On the morning of April 7, reconnaissance flights noted activity suggesting a large raid was imminent. At 12:26 p.m., Coast Watcher messages confirmed a major formation heading toward Guadalcanal. By around 2 p.m., Henderson Field went to full alert, preparing every available fighter for immediate launch. Earlier that day, around noon, 2nd Lieutenant Sweat had taken 4 4th Wildcat fighters on a standard combat air patrol over the Russell Islands, roughly 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The patrol found nothing unusual. After about 2 hours in the air with fuel running low, the division returned to Henderson Field and landed shortly before 2 p.m. Their aircraft were parked in revetments, and ground crews began manually pumping aviation fuel into the tanks. Each Wildcat required more than 100 gallons, a process that would take roughly half an hour. Sweat climbed out, stretched, and expected to wait. The situation shifted suddenly. With the raid now confirmed, the operations officer ordered an immediate scramble. Even partially refueled aircraft would have to launch. Being caught on the ground was far worse. Sweat was still beside his Wildcat when the alarm sounded. Ground crew members shouted for him to get airborne. The fuel line was pulled from his wing tank, spilling gasoline as fighters began starting engines around him. In total, 76 Allied fighters scrambled into the sky, Marine. Wildcats, Corsairs, P-40 Warhawks, P-38 Lightnings, and P-39 Airacobras. Every fighter within reach was sent up to meet the incoming strike. The Wildcat represented an early generation of American carrier-based fighters. By 1943, it was already outclassed in speed and maneuverability by newer Japanese aircraft, but it remained formidable in the hands of experienced pilots. Armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, it carried about 1,440 rounds of ammunition, enough for roughly 20 seconds of sustained fire. Its maximum speed reached about 318 mph at altitude, and its climb rate under ideal conditions approached 1,900 feet per minute, though combat loads reduced performance. Compared with Japanese fighters, it turned less sharply and climbed more slowly, and its range was limited. Yet the Wildcat's strengths lay in its rugged construction and heavy armament. It could absorb significant damage and keep flying, and its machine guns delivered powerful hits. American pilots had adapted their tactics accordingly, favoring diving attacks, teamwork, and quick disengagement rather than turning dogfights. Sweat pushed the throttle forward, and the Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines surged to full power. The heavily loaded fighter accelerated down the short runway, needing nearly every foot to reach takeoff speed. At about 70 mph, he eased back on the controls and lifted into the air. As soon as he was airborne, he manually retracted the landing gear by cranking the mechanism repeatedly, a process that took roughly half a minute and required one hand off the throttle. Once clear of the field, he joined his wingmen and began climbing hard. The incoming dive bombers were expected at 15,000 to 20,000 feet, and American fighters needed to meet them at altitude. The climb felt painfully slow. Under combat conditions, reaching 15,000 feet could take nearly 9 minutes. All around him, other fighters clawed upward, racing against time. Below, the waters near Guadalcanal held American ships, cruisers, destroyers, cargo vessels, and support craft filled with thousands of sailors unaware of the approaching strike force. Radio channels buzzed with Coast Watcher updates, fighter control instructions, and pilot reports. This was aerial warfare before advanced radar networks and modern command systems. Everything relied on sight and voice communication. Around 2:15 p.m. at roughly 14,000 feet over the Russell Islands, Sweat saw the first signs of the enemy. Tiny dark shapes appeared against the distant sky to the northwest, rapidly growing larger. The formation was vast, far larger than anything he had encountered before, stretching across miles of sky in disciplined groups. It was the full Japanese strike, closing in with precision and determination. Sweat pressed his microphone and calmly reported the sighting to his formation, masking the tension he felt as the long-anticipated battle finally began. The fighter controller's message was brief. All aircraft were cleared to engage and hunt freely. There would be no intricate maneuvering plans or careful coordination, just immediate combat. 76 American fighters rose to meet 177 incoming Japanese planes. Lieutenant James Sweat rolled his Wildcat into a sharp diving turn, aiming for the approaching dive bomber formations, while his wingmen stayed in position as best they could amid the chaos. Below them flew the Aichi D3A Val dive bombers in orderly groups. Each aircraft carried a pilot, a rear gunner, and a 1,000-pound bomb. Though outdated and relatively slow, these planes were extremely dangerous if allowed to reach their targets. Sweat chose a small group that had drifted slightly from the main formation. He positioned his section above and behind them for a high-speed attack from altitude. The rear gunners might notice him, but tracking a diving fighter would be difficult. Accelerating to roughly 350 miles per hour, Sweat leveled out behind the last bomber in the group. The target quickly filled his gun sight as the distance shrank 200 yards, then 150, then 100. He fired. The Wildcat's 50 caliber machine guns roared, the recoil shaking the aircraft. Tracer rounds struck the bomber's fuselage and wing, tearing it apart. The rear gun fell silent as smoke and flames appeared. Moments later, the aircraft exploded, his first victory. There was no time to pause. He immediately pursued a second bomber that tried to dive away toward the sea. Staying just above and behind, he fired controlled bursts until it too caught fire and crashed. Less than half a minute had passed and 2 enemy aircraft were down. Sweat then climbed after the third. The Val was slow, barely 200 miles per hour in level flight, and could not escape. At close range, another burst destroyed it. In about 90 seconds of combat, 3 bombers had been eliminated, all of which would otherwise have threatened American ships. During the attack, however, Sweat had become separated from his section. His wingmen were scattered across the sky, each engaged elsewhere. Alone, he rejoined the main battle just as anti-aircraft guns from the fleet below began firing at every aircraft in sight. At altitude, gunners struggled to tell friend from foe. Shell bursts filled the sky. One detonation erupted near his left wing, sending shrapnel through the metal and damaging an aileron. The Wildcat became harder to control and required constant correction. He checked his gauges. Engine temperature and oil pressure were still acceptable, and the controls responded despite the damage. He decided to stay in the fight. Soon he spotted another formation of 6 dive bombers approaching the harbor for their run. They had lost their fighter cover and were flying in a loose line. Sweat dove from above with the sun behind him and attacked the last plane. Closing to under 100 yards, he opened fire. The bomber exploded almost instantly, likely due to its own bomb detonating. He pushed through smoke and debris, then selected the next target and fired again. Another bomber went down. Moving methodically along the line, he conserved ammunition and destroyed additional aircraft one by one. The fourth required repeated hits. By then, his ammunition supply was nearly gone. At extremely close range, less than 50 yards, he fired until it too burned and fell. With those victories, his tally reached 7 enemy planes. In roughly 15 minutes, he had achieved the number of aerial victories required to be considered an ace. Yet one more bomber was still heading toward the ships at very low altitude. Sweat pursued, but when he pressed the trigger, nothing happened. His ammunition, about 1,440 rounds, had been completely expended. The logical decision would have been to withdraw, rearm, and return. Instead, he pressed on, flying directly at the bomber in an effort to force it away from its target. The Japanese rear gunner responded with heavy fire. Bullets struck the Wildcat repeatedly. The windscreen shattered, and fragments cut Sweat's face, blood running into his eyes. His engine began to run roughly as more rounds hit vital components. Oil pressure dropped and temperature rose. The oil cooler had been damaged. The Pratt & Whitney engine that had carried him through the mission was now failing as he continued his attack. Sweat broke off his attack and pointed his fighter back toward Henderson Field, trying to reach the airstrip before the failing engine quit entirely. The Wildcat shook violently as the power plant misfired. Dark smoke poured from the nose, and oil splattered across the windscreen. Blood from facial injuries and a shattered canopy had already reduced his visibility. Now it was barely usable. He was about 15 miles from base, flying a crippled aircraft while wounded and losing engine power by the second. Beneath him lay Tulagi Harbor and Florida Island. If the engine stopped, he would be forced into the water. A landing near the harbor offered some chance of rescue. In the open ocean, survival would be unlikely. The decision was made for him when the Pratt & Whitney engine seized with a grinding shriek. The propeller froze, and the fighter instantly became a powerless glider. With perhaps 2 minutes of glide remaining, Sweat adjusted for best glide speed around 110 mph and searched for a suitable spot to ditch. The waters near Florida Island appeared relatively calm. If he could put the aircraft down cleanly without it flipping or breaking apart, he might live. The final approach demanded precision. He manually lowered the landing gear to act as drag, opened the canopy for a quick escape, and tightened his harness. The entry angle had to be exact, too steep and the nose would dig in. too shallow and the aircraft would skip and tumble. He aimed for a slight nose-up attitude and minimum controlled speed. At 50 feet, he began easing back on the stick, bleeding off the last bit of speed. 40 feet, 30, 20, 10. The tail touched first, just as planned. The aircraft slowed abruptly as water resistance surged. Even with his straps tight, the deceleration hurled him forward hard enough to smash his face into the instrument panel, breaking his nose. Pain flared instantly. The fighter settled and began sinking at once, its heavy engine dragging the nose downward. Water rushed into the cockpit through the open canopy. He had only seconds to get out. With blood-slick hands, he released his belt and tried to climb free, but his parachute harness snagged on something inside the cockpit. The water level climbed rapidly, chest, chin, then over his head. Trapped in a sinking aircraft in shallow water after surviving intense combat, he was now drowning. His lungs burned. Darkness crept in. With one final desperate effort, he tore the harness loose and forced himself upward, swimming blindly toward the surface. His life vest, which should have inflated automatically, had not deployed, perhaps damaged by shrapnel or tangled. He was nearly out of air when it suddenly activated. The vest expanded and shot him upward. He broke the surface gasping, blood and seawater running down his face. Despite the injuries and shock, he was alive. The air battle continued overhead. Aircraft maneuvered and guns fired while explosions echoed around the harbor. Roughly 15 minutes later, a Coast Guard rescue boat spotted him and pulled him aboard. He received morphine and basic treatment, and someone handed him a bottle of whiskey, which he drank gratefully. He was taken to Tulagi and then to a naval hospital on Guadalcanal. Doctors cleaned and stitched his facial wounds, set his broken nose, and checked for other injuries. Remarkably, aside from the facial trauma, he had no serious internal damage. During recovery, he was visited by fellow pilots and intelligence officers. Witnesses confirmed that in his first combat mission, he had shot down 7 enemy aircraft, making him an instant ace, one of the rare ace-in-a-day pilots. Admiral Mark Mitchell personally recommended him for the Medal of Honor. After recuperating, Sweat returned to duty with VMF 221, which was transitioning from Wildcats to the more advanced 4U Corsair. He trained on the new aircraft in Australia before returning to operations in the Russell Islands. On June 30, 1943, now a first lieutenant, he flew cover for Allied landings at Rendover Island, destroying 2 Mitsubishi Gi-4M bombers and sharing credit for a 0. 11 days later, near New Georgia, he shot down 2 more bombers and a pursuing 0 while protecting his wingman. Moments later, another 0 caught him from behind and damaged his Corsair's engine and fuel system. For the second time in 3 months, he was forced to ditch at sea, this time far from friendly forces. He landed successfully and deployed his life raft, drifting in enemy-controlled waters. Several hours later, 2 Solomon Islanders in a canoe, scouts working with Australian coast watchers, found him and took him to their village. From there, he was moved by larger canoe to a hidden coast watching station in the jungle. An Australian radio operator arranged his evacuation, and a PBY Catalina flying boat retrieved him the next day. The local islanders and Coast Watcher network had saved many Allied lives. Sweat later said the small payment they received hardly reflected their bravery. He returned to combat that fall. Over Bougainville, he shot down 1-0 and damaged another. In November, he added 2 dive bombers and possibly a Kawasaki Ki-61. By December 1943, at just 23 years old, he had flown 103 combat missions and achieved 15 confirmed victories. In October of that year, while still in the theater, Major General Ralph J. Mitchell presented him with the Medal of Honor at Espiritu Santo. The citation recognized his actions on April 7, 1943, when he led an attack against a superior bomber force, shot down multiple aircraft despite heavy fire and personal injury, and safely ditched his damaged fighter near Tulagi. The Marine Corps concluded that Sweat needed time away from combat duty. He left the war zone on December 11, 1943. Reached the United States by the end of the month, and soon reported to Marine Corps Air Station Santa Barbara in California. There, his assignment was to prepare new aviators for operations in the Pacific Theater. In the spring of 1944, First Lieutenant Sweat visited Washington, D.C., where he attended a White House ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. During the event, he met President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt, who had previously served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, asked detailed questions about the Corsair fighter and aerial tactics used in the Pacific. Sweat later remarked that the president showed genuine curiosity. Although the meeting was scheduled to be brief, it extended to roughly 20 minutes because Roosevelt continued asking follow-up questions about air combat. By late 1944, Sweat had been transferred to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California. There, VMF 221 trained for Operation Olympic, the planned Allied invasion of Japan set for November 1945. The unit flew 4 E-4 Corsairs and was tasked with providing close air support for landing forces. Among the pilots, there was little doubt that the operation would result in heavy casualties. Events took a dramatic turn in August 1945 when atomic bombs struck Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan announced its surrender on August 15, bringing the war to an end and cancelling Operation Olympic. By that point, VMF 221 ranked second among Marine fighter squadrons with 185 confirmed aerial victories. After World War II, Sweat took command of Marine Fighting Squadron 141, which operated Corsair aircraft from a naval air station in California. When war broke out in Korea in June 1950, the squadron was deployed overseas, but Sweat was not permitted to accompany them. Naval leadership had adopted a policy that Medal of Honor recipients should be kept out of frontline combat due to their symbolic value. Sweat objected strongly, insisting he should lead his pilots, but the decision remained unchanged. Around 1950, he left active duty while continuing to serve in the Marine Corps Reserve. He eventually retired in 1970 as a colonel after nearly 3 decades of military service. Returning to civilian life in San Francisco, Sweat joined the family business manufacturing marine pumps and turbines. The company, founded by his father in 1920, supplied essential equipment for maritime operations. After years in aviation, Sweat went back to factory work, gradually regaining the physical wear of manual labor as he handled machinery and components. When his father died in 1960, he took over the company and managed it for more than 2 decades, maintaining its reputation for reliable engineering. Later, he passed the business on to his son, preserving the family enterprise. The firm remained relatively small but financially stable, providing jobs and dependable products. In retirement, Sweat moved first to Trinity Center, California, and later to Redding. He became known for speaking at schools and community events. Rather than focusing on combat exploits, he emphasized values such as responsibility, teamwork, and good citizenship. He stressed preparation, discipline, and the importance of maintaining equipment. When asked about wartime experiences, he typically highlighted cooperation and training rather than personal heroics. In 2006, the History Channel recreated his April 7, 1943 mission in an episode of Dogfights using computer-generated imagery. Sweat contributed commentary, describing events in a calm, straightforward manner similar to how he discussed engineering topics. The program aired on November 24, 2006, introducing his story to younger audiences, many of whom were struck by the contrast between his quiet demeanor and the intensity of the recreated battle scenes. Throughout his life, he remained someone who viewed extraordinary actions as simply part of his duty. Colonel James Elm Sweat died on January 18, 2009, at age 88, after a prolonged illness. He passed away in a hospital in Redding, California. His funeral at Northern California Veterans Cemetery in Ego included full military honors. Hundreds attended, among them former members of VMF 221, other Medal of Honor recipients, and representatives from both the Marine Corps and Navy. Aircraft flew overhead in a missing man formation. A Marine Honor Guard conducted a 21-gun salute, and the flag from his casket was formally presented to his family. Sweat's life illustrates broader themes about the character of many who served in World War II. He did not come from a military lineage or elite academy. Instead, he was a working-class young man from the San Francisco Bay Area with strong flying skills and notable determination. Similar stories unfolded across the Pacific. Civilians from varied occupations became soldiers, sailors, and airmen who ultimately helped defeat well-trained professional forces. The United States relied on systematic training, modern equipment, decentralized decision-making, and encouragement of initiative. These practices differed from rigid authoritarian models and proved effective in combat. Sweat's success on his first mission, where he downed 7 enemy aircraft, was the result of preparation, equipment, and the autonomy given to pilots. His decision to continue attacking even after running out of ammunition reflected the independence expected of American aviators. Such initiative, combined with industrial strength and training standards, played a key role in Allied success. Industrial production also shaped the war's outcome. During World War II, the United States built roughly 324,000 aircraft. Germany produced about 94,000, while Japan manufactured approximately 76,000 combat planes. Beyond sheer numbers, American aircraft were typically more robust, better supplied with ammunition and equipment, and supported by well-trained maintenance crews with plentiful spare parts. A destroyed American fighter could often be replaced quickly, whereas Axis forces struggled with shortages and slower production. Pilot training followed a similar emphasis on quality. Of more than 317,000 cadets who began flight training in the United States, about 193,000 completed the program. Washout rates remained high even during pilot shortages because poorly prepared aviators were unlikely to survive or succeed. Japan, facing mounting losses, eventually reduced its training standards. The American approach, prioritizing preparation, equipment, and individual initiative, produced a large number of capable pilots who performed at levels that opposing commanders often found surprising. By the final phase of the Pacific Air War, many newly trained Japanese aviators were entering battle with fewer than 100 total flight hours. In contrast, American pilots such as James Sweat often accumulated hundreds of hours in the air before ever seeing combat, followed by rigorous military preparation. This imbalance proved decisive. Inexperienced Japanese flyers were frequently shot down during their first operations, unable to match the skill, training, and equipment of USS pilots. As veteran Japanese airmen were lost faster than replacements could be properly trained, the overall quality of their air forces declined. Losses mounted, experience diminished, and the situation deteriorated further with each passing month. Meanwhile, the United States maintained a steady flow of well-trained pilots flying increasingly advanced aircraft. These airmen were supported by vast industrial output and a logistical system capable of supplying them without interruption. Even so, technological and organizational advantages did not eliminate personal risk. Pilots like Sweat still faced lethal danger in every mission. Bravery alone could not guarantee survival, but it remained a necessary part of the job. When the war ended, the country to which Sweat returned was dramatically different from the one he had left. Mobilization for total war had transformed the American economy. What had once been a nation struggling with Depression-era stagnation was now characterized by full employment and rapidly expanding production. Entire industries had emerged in a remarkably short time, and the nation discovered a capacity for large-scale organization and output it had never fully realized before. Veterans coming home could see the connection clearly. The industrial strength that produced bombers and fighters during the war now powered peacetime manufacturing and economic growth. Systems built to manage military supply chains were redirected towards civilian distribution networks. Engineers who had designed weapons shifted to designing consumer goods. The United States entered the post-war era positioned to dominate through industrial productivity. The small pump manufacturing business operated by the Sweat family reflected this broader pattern. It was modest in size, locally owned, technically capable, and consistently profitable. Thousands of similar firms across the country formed the backbone of the post-war economy. They were not widely celebrated, yet they provided essential components and machinery that kept industry running. Sweat chose to return to this family enterprise rather than pursue public recognition. Although he had received the Medal of Honor, he did not define himself by it. His priorities were practical: steady work, family responsibilities, and service to his community. This outlook mirrored that of many World War II veterans. After returning home, they resumed civilian life, started families, paid taxes, and took part in local civic affairs without seeking special status. Their reputation as the greatest generation came not only from battlefield actions but also from their collective focus on rebuilding and contributing to society in the decades that followed. When speaking to students later in life, Sweat emphasized preparation, discipline, and responsibility rather than recounting combat exploits. He spoke about the value of competence and hard work as foundations for security and respect. Discussions of aerial combat were brief and factual when they arose. He avoided glorifying violence or expressing hostility toward former enemies. Public memory of the Second World War shifted over time. By the 1982, it was often viewed as a conflict with clear moral justification and a decisive conclusion. Veterans received growing recognition and appreciation for their service. This differed from earlier years when attention had shifted toward later conflicts such as Korea and Vietnam. James Sweat's death in 2009 marked the end of a life that had spanned nearly 90 years and witnessed extraordinary national change. Born in 1920, during a period when the United States was still recovering from the First World War, he lived to see his country emerge as a dominant global power in the 21st century. That transformation depended on the efforts of millions, but individuals like Sweat played a meaningful role. His brief but intense combat engagement in April 1943 represented only a small part of a vast war effort. Yet thousands of similar missions carried out by trained pilots, supported by a powerful industrial and logistical system, gradually overwhelmed Japan's ability to continue the fight. The military structure surrounding James Sweat made acts of bravery possible, but it did not manufacture them. When his ammunition ran out and he kept fighting, that choice came from his own judgment rather than from any procedural directive. Surviving a forced landing at sea required personal endurance, not institutional planning. The decades he spent working and serving after the war reflected qualities formed long before his enlistment. The organization gave him a chance to act. He supplied the skill and nerve to use it. Each depended on the other, yet neither alone would have produced the same outcome. Sweat's story continues to resonate because it reflects traits widely associated with American civic culture: initiative instead of unquestioning compliance, accountability over reliance on authority, and practical ability valued more than rank or status. His manner was restrained. He avoided self-promotion, favored teamwork, and displayed steady rather than theatrical courage. In many ways, he stood for the countless ordinary citizens who rose to meet extraordinary demands during wartime. He maintained that he had only carried out his duty, but his exceptional performance, like that of thousands of others, helped defeat formidable adversaries and laid groundwork for a long period of stability and growth. The United States he defended in the early 1940s faced serious internal problems, including segregation and uneven economic opportunity. Yet, it also offered a vision of advancement based on merit, inspired hope abroad, and managed to combine personal freedom with shared national purpose more effectively than many earlier systems. Sweat's own path from industrial worker to decorated fighter pilot and then back to civilian life running a family business illustrated a society less bound by class than many of its contemporaries. He did not aim to become a public figure. Recognition followed him because of events. His Medal of Honor brought visibility, and his first combat mission made him widely known. His modest conduct after the war turned him into an example others could look to. Accepting that attention with quiet dignity became another form of service. Later in life, when invited to assist with a historical reenactment of his mission, he agreed. He provided careful details so the portrayal would be accurate, believing that younger audiences should understand what earlier generations had accomplished and at what cost. His grave lies in Northern California, marked by a simple headstone listing his name, rank, dates, and decoration. It does not attempt to summarize his achievements. Around him rest other veterans, some killed in action, others who lived into old age. In that setting, distinctions fade. All are equal in remembrance. Such equality would have suited him. He neither sought special privileges nor insisted on attention because of honors received. The principles guiding his life were straightforward. Perform your work properly, support those beside you, care for your tools, take responsibility, and keep your word. These values came from a working-class upbringing and proved as useful in business as in combat. He lived 88 years, including the brief but decisive minutes of aerial combat over Guadalcanal that defined his wartime legacy. His story endures not because it was singular, but because it mirrored the experiences of many who answered their country's call, exceeded expectations, and returned to civilian life without demanding praise. Together, they built communities, raised families, and contributed to decades of post-war prosperity. Their collective impact was immense, and their modesty equally notable. Sweat's life suggests that remarkable results can come from ordinary individuals when preparation, opportunity, and determination intersect. He possessed no supernatural qualities. He received training, equipment, and motivation within an organized system. Circumstances tested him, and his character carried him through. The outcome was striking, but the path leading to it was understandable. With similar preparation and resolve, others might have achieved comparable feats. That pattern-effective systems paired with capable individuals helped produce success during the Second World War and in later challenges. When he died in 2009, many of his generation were also passing away. His death marked the conclusion of one life while leaving intact the ideals it represented: courage paired with humility, competence balanced by restraint, service linked to citizenship. Those traits remain relevant regardless of changes in technology or shifting global conditions. By remembering James Elm Sweat, we also acknowledge the broader generation to which he belonged. Examining his experiences offers lessons still applicable today. Preserving such histories ensures that future generations understand both what was achieved and the values that made those achievements possible. He began as a working man, became a celebrated pilot, and ultimately returned to ordinary life. The cycle reflected a democratic ideal: answer the call when needed, remain modest afterward, and treat useful work as a worthy calling. For someone who insisted he was simply doing his job, that quiet legacy may be the most fitting tribute.